Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, we're checking back in with Warfronts because they are covering the Israel and Hamas ceasefire that just went into effect. In this video, they say, here's what you need to know. So this is something I've been covering ever since, well, since my channel started. And obviously more attention went to it over the last couple of years. But let's see what's going on here. And I'll try to find ways to bring up historical context that can tell us where, I guess, things need to go next. And of course, where things have come from. Our original videos down below. Make sure you're supporting Warfronts. So to my originals channel, it's linked down below as well. Let's get started. All right, so this is a step in the right direction, even if it may seem like a small step and that there are so many things that really have to take place still to have a long-lasting peace and stability in this conflict that has gone on for decades and decades. But let's analyze the step we're at right now.
After 2 years and a day of nearly continuous fighting, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire. In a deal signed yesterday at a conference in Egypt, the Netanyahu government and the leadership of Hamas came to a key series of agreements that will draw down hostilities and place the Middle East on track to finally establish a permanent peace. Within the next several days, Israel will retreat.
I mean, permanent peace in the most immediacy, I guess that's what you can call, but there's still so many outstanding issues of what's to happen with Israel and Palestine as a whole, the autonomy of the region, the coexistence of the region, whatever that needs to look like. This is very much needs to be looked at as not a long-term solution. At best, maybe a band-aid for the wound that is, gushing blood right now. But this region needs surgery.
Its forces across much of the Gaza Strip. Hamas will release its last group of living hostages, and humanitarian aid will finally surge into a war zone where it is desperately needed.
Right.
For the first time in many months, there is genuine cause for optimism on the Israel-Hamas conflict, and with a whole lot of luck, this ceasefire could lead to an extended period of peace and reconstruction. But if peace truly is on the horizon, it's not going to happen by accident.
Historical context says that, again, just a ceasefire here is not paving the way for future peace. There's a lot of long-term things that, again, need to happen here, because that framing that he's saying here has literally happened for decades and decades, and it doesn't do the long-term peace.
Israel and Hamas are going to have to make peace, first by holding to this ceasefire, and then by working their way through the massive enduring issues that still stand in the way. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is an immensely positive sign, but it is not the end of the story, and it's what Israel and Hamas do with the new ceasefire that will determine whether the people of Israel and the people of Gaza can finally return to a life without war.
And that's a very important thing. Obviously, you have to be at kind of a ceasefire to talk about the long-term things. You got to take care of the current thing, the current most pressing issues, I guess, before you got to talk about the long-term issues. I just hope that is going to be paved for those long-term issues to potentially be worked out in a institutionalized way. But it's hard to not be cynical about it, right?
And now a quick word from our sponsor, me, or more precisely, my website, fronts.co. Have you ever found yourself thinking, there's just not enough content on Warfronts. 6 videos a week is just not enough for me.
Which book was that in?
I want the world to be crazier.
Which book of the Bible was that in?
I want more war, more death. Well, 1, what's wrong with you? And 2, well, great news. Extra Warfronts content is now at your fingertips over at fronts.co. Look at that.
Man.
Look at that. Yes.
Simon must have such a
very
huge
week, we'll be posting 2 exclusive videos every week to our new subscriber-only website, fronts.co.
So many channels. He's just non-stop working, man.
You'll gain access to brand new Warfronts content that won't be available on YouTube. Our first videos are already up, exploring topics
He's like
as
an institution in himself now.
The war against Russia, and
wonder how many people work for him.
As how South Korea came to build the best tank on Earth, and to sweeten the deal, we're also asking our writers to contribute 2 in-depth written articles each week, exploring some unusual or less appreciated angle on geopolitics and warfare. So, not only will you get more of the videos you love, you'll also get a chance to read some of our writers' unfiltered
check that out,
takes on
everybody.
war news. So look, if you
let
like
me know
this
if it's
channel,
good content.
Fronts.co. Again, $5 a month. It helps support us.
Shut up and take my money.
Fronts, Warfronts, Political Fronts, and Fronts.co. And nothing is changing here. I have learned from the mistakes of past YouTubers. We are not doing a paywall on any existing content. The 6 videos a week will be here for you just as before. It's all just gravy, baby.
Man, 6 a week.
Don't know why I went all Austin Powers there.
Gotta have a lot of help with that.
Yeah, Fronts.co. Just go there.
Good domain, right? It was expensive.
Really? Already existed? All right, the current deal. Let's see what we got.
So before we begin today's episode, quick word about timing, because even with both Israel and Hamas signaling their support of the ceasefire, the situation across the Middle East is...
Okay, sorry, it's getting back to a very serious subject, but does Simon have a thing that says Warfronts? Is that a channel too? Is there like an anime channel for weebs? What? Is that what he is too?
very fluid. As such, everything that we discuss in this episode is accurate to the best of our knowledge and ability through the start of day on October the 10th, local time in Jerusalem and Gaza City.
So in the couple days or so it's been since I'm recording this, the transfer of hostages has begun. There have been exchanges. There's also been an incredible amount of misinformation that's pumped out. You know, one of the things that you see maybe some outlets wanting to do is now try to drive the narrative of what the conditions were like for the hostages on both sides, and backed by whatever predispositions you already have. There's so many things they're talking about about what things were like for them, and then like immediately have had counter narratives to them. So people are really trying to drive and get ahead of the framing of what the hostage conditions were like, again, on both sides. That's what's, so hard about current events too, is since there are so many presuppositions and predetermined ideas and framing, that misinformation is most likely to happen at its earliest point in every stage of especially military conflicts. And it can be very easy, I think, to get into that and just buy into it and get hooked by it, get baited, if you will. Because it's always harder to change your mind than to be convinced of something in the first place. So we want to make conclusions as simply as possible, but too often we also do this before the dust even settles. And to be honest, I think if you disagree with what I said, there's a good chance you have been one of those people biting the bait, right?
Anything that's happened after that time won't be accounted for over the course of the discussion, although you can rest assured that if anything really major does take place, we're of course going to come back and cover it. Now, the talks that led to the new ceasefire between Israel and Hamas have gone on for weeks, but it was only over the last few days that the world started to sense a breakthrough. High-level American officials descended on the scene of negotiations, Middle Eastern leaders tightened the screws on Hamas's leaders behind the scenes, and by the late hours of Wednesday evening, it had become clear that an announcement was imminent.
And this definitely will require collaboration of a lot of countries, because whether a lot of bordering countries or countries may not be bordering but are connected with this, whether they like it or not, are going to have to be part of the solution and have a right to be.
Within the span of just hours, the respective leadership of Israel and Hamas had each confirmed that they had accepted a set of terms. The agreement was formalized the following day when representatives of each group signed the deal in Egypt. The deal commits
Egypt being one of those two. Egypt shares a border with Gaza as well as Israel, and actually can control access in and out of that region, which has been largely closed actually during this whole conflict. Egypt gets tied up in the middle of this too, because they also have connections and active deals with Israel going back decades ago with conflicts between the countries. And then also the United States, obviously the biggest supporter of Israel around the world. So like I was saying, countries like that kind of have to be a part of this.
Israel and Hamas to participation in the first phase of what's expected to be a multi-stage ceasefire, with negotiations on the following stages set to continue. As of the time of writing, the full text of the agreement hasn't yet been released to the global public, but according to reports from outlets across the world, the first phase seems to revolve around three key provisions. First, Israel and Hamas will mutually engage in an exchange of prisoners, with Hamas committing to release all 20 of its remaining living Israeli hostages in one go. There will not be any of the inflammatory ceremonies that Hamas...
See what the numbers are like on the other side, because there are and have been a lot of detained Palestinians in the hands of Israelis. And I wonder if the hostage, it needs to be like a 1-for-1 ratio, but they were saying all. Also, do we know exactly how many hostages there are on both sides? Is it really 20 remaining on one side? And then what is that number on the other side? And how can you confirm that? How transparent are you going to need to be? Can there be, be investigations of what the numbers of detainees actually are?
Hamas is organized around go. There will not be any of the inflammatory ceremonies that Hamas has organized around prior releases. In return, Israel is expected to release around 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, including over 1,700 who were detained in the Gaza Strip, and 250 Palestinians currently serving life sentences in Israeli custody. The remaining deceased.
So again, a lot of those too from before the October 7th conflict for other actions against Israel or whatever. There has been a big conversation about due process around the evidence of crimes of those detainees.
Israeli hostages will be released as they become available, although as of now, Hamas states that some of those remains have still yet to be collected. Also, as part of the deal, Israeli forces have agreed to a phased withdrawal from parts of the Gaza Strip, although its forces will remain present in some areas. According to Washington, Israel will withdraw to about 58% of Gaza's territory in total,
so not all
of the more than 80% of Gaza that Israel controlled the day it agreed to the ceasefire.
Those are the most populous areas, the ones that are not in the yellow there.
Thursday, an Israeli spokesperson suggested,
but they're also the areas that have been, bombed into rubble.
Israel controlled the day it agreed to the ceasefire. On Thursday, an Israeli spokesperson suggested that Israel may occupy closer to 53% of Gaza, although the reason for the discrepancy was unclear. Under Washington's specifications, Israel will maintain its presence in most of Rafah and a majority of Khan Yunis, as well as several other areas that.
Rafah was a place, especially early on, that a lot of the refugees moved south to, right on the border of Egypt, ended up being a zone where, again, a lot of people were moved into, but also got attacked. Israeli reports that there was like Hamas activities in these areas, and that other people have, claimed refutation of that, but
used to be densely populated Gaza neighborhoods. Israel will retain control of all border access points, and although it's not explicitly covered in the ceasefire, it's unlikely that Gazans will be immediately able to return to the areas that they used to call home.
I have seen just some footage and I guess stories of people that have returned to some of those areas that they've been away from for months. And in a lot of those instances, of course, returning to, rubble. That's one of the big things that's going to have to be talked about is the amount of destruction of the buildings and the infrastructure there is going to take so much to rebuild. I mean, we're talking years. And where is that funding going to come from? These are definitely issues that are going to have to be addressed to have any kind of normalcy here.
Israel and Hamas will both commit to a full stop to the fighting. Finally, Israel is expected to allow at least 400 aid trucks to surge into Gaza almost immediately, and then allow aid to regularly flow into Gaza from that point forward at the rate of about 600 aid trucks a day. That's enough to match the pre-war needs of Gaza's population and start to refill stocks of critical supplies like fuel, medicine, and hospital supplies.
Next steps. Okay.
So, now that Israel and Hamas have formally agreed to the ceasefire, the first step will be to actually stop fighting, something that has not actually happened at the time we're putting this episode together.
And this is such a delicate situation because on either side, it could take one person that engages any type of violence that could ruin the whole thing. You could have 99% of the people that are totally committed to peace and are not going to ever think about breaking it. And then there can be that, not even 1%, the percentage of the percent that can engage in some kind of violence, and then it throws the whole thing out the door. Such a fragile thing. And if that was to happen, is everything going to go out the window then? Or is someone willing to take it onto the chin, I guess, in some way? Because so much of what happens in these conflicts is just retaliation ping pong.
Although Israeli forces ended hostilities in most areas, intermittent explosions rang out across Gaza all day on Thursday, including in multiple zones in the central and southern regions. According to Israeli sources, those strikes only hit targets that posed an imminent threat to Israeli troops as they repositioned, while the daily death toll reported by the authorities in Gaza was unusually low, but not zero. According to the count released on Thursday, 11 bodies were brought to hospitals in the prior 24 hours and 49 other people were counted as wounded. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, confirmed on Thursday that they're preparing to transition towards strictly defensive lines as the ceasefire takes effect. And then there's the release of...
Yeah, because it is hard to just flip a switch all of a sudden. Ceasefire to no ceasefire. Any conflict.
Strictly defensive lines as the ceasefire takes effect. And then there's the release of the living hostages, which is expected to take place within a 72-hour window.
Wait, there's such thing as dead hostages?
Signed the deal. That window,
I guess, just for repatriation.
So Hamas is expected to release all 20 hostages by or before then. They will be brought to 3 hospitals near Tel Aviv, where they'll be evaluated, nourished, and reunited with their loved ones. As for the bodies of deceased hostages, it's not clear when all of them will be returned or how many will be returned in the coming few days, but international...
That'll be an interesting one, because will either side want to publicly acknowledge, the death of some of these hostages or detainees in their captivity? Could that just fuel more animosity? That seems like something that could really be harmful in these kind of next stages.
Observers have stressed that the process could take weeks or even months. The locations of some of the hostage bodies aren't currently known, partly because the Hamas members responsible for keeping track of them have, in some cases, been killed. 28 bodies of hostages are still thought to be located in Gaza. In return, Hamas has submitted a list of the prisoners that it wishes to see released. Israel will publish that list, and people who have been victimized by attacks that those prisoners perpetrated will have 24 hours to make their objections known. Several names that are expected to be on Hamas's list are also expected to be a point of contention, especially Marwan al-Barghouti, who Palestinians consistently identify as their preferred head of state in a hypothetical sovereign nation.
It has often been difficult to have a unification of political intent with Gaza and with the West Bank, which, collectively calling Palestine, right? They're separated. They've had separate governing bodies. There's been disagreements of unified political leadership that can govern both effectively, as especially in this last couple years, the two regions, being cut off.
And former militant leader Ahmed Sadat. Israel has already stated that it will not allow Barghouti's release. Meanwhile, the United Nations will help surge aid into the Gaza Strip, an initiative that UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres has indicated that the UN is prepared to start immediately. By the estimates of the UN's emergency aid chief, there are 170,000 tons of aid already prepared to flow immediately into the territory, and that aid is desperately needed.
This has been a point of contention for so long because the difficulty of getting aid in. You may have heard of stories of Israel blocking aid going in, but then also probably heard stories they're saying that aid going in just gets seized by Hamas and not given to the civilians. Again, so much of that has been debated on and accused of. So we'll see what will happen with this, with a ceasefire going on, and we'll see if there will be third-party observations of this or actually dispensing of this aid so that those, type of accusations can't hold any weight.
According to a Wednesday study published in The Lancet, almost 55,000 children under the age of 6 are thought to be acutely malnourished across Gaza. After the early phases of implementation are complete, Israel, Hamas, and their international mediators will turn their attention toward future stages of the ceasefire deal, probably engaging around the terms of the 20-point peace plan that the Trump administration laid out in late September. The deal calls for Israel to grant amnesty to Hamas members and for those ex-militants and the rest.
It's going to be calling like Trump's 20 points, kind of like, Wilson's 14 points going into World War I. How many of them will go into effect? There was such a big debate, going into what ends up going to the Treaty of Versailles. And, not everything, or at least to the extent of it, went into the Treaty of Versailles. We know the treaty was a mess. So I've not seen exactly what's gone into these 20 points, though. I don't know if he's going to talk about it, but that's something I'll try to catch up on, especially at the next stage of any news that breaks out.
Of the Gaza population to be offered safe passage abroad if they'd like to leave the territory. In exchange, Hamas will disarm voluntarily and will not be allowed to participate in the future administration of the Gaza Strip, either directly or indirectly. Under the plan, the Gazan reconstruction will begin and the territory's residents will not be forced to leave against their will, contradicting prior plans for which Trump has voiced his support. Israel will be barred from...
That has brought in so much suspicion when they're talking about how the U.S. is going to, build this up, and Trump, as a real estate developer, going to make this become this like Middle Eastern Riviera. A lot of cynical opinions, I think, are tied to that about what is going to happen in the rebuilding process here.
Contradicting prior plans for which Trump has voiced his support. Israel will be barred from occupying or annexing Gaza, while the territory will be temporarily administered by a, quote, technocratic and apolitical Palestinian committee, managed in turn by an international board of overseers that will be led by Trump himself.
Interesting. I mean, technocratic and apolitical. What is that going to mean? Is that achievable? So this like apolitical Palestinian committee, does that mean, would that then mean non-elected? And is that a good thing?
Of course, there's a lot of ambition tied up in all of those objectives, and it should be transparently obvious that some points of Trump's plan will be very difficult to achieve under even the best of circumstances.
Oh, like what?
But whether that plan is held constant, whether it's modified or renegotiated, or whether it's abandoned in favor of another framework, are questions that will be hammered out between the negotiating teams as this ceasefire process moves forward.
Did any of you get vibes when he was saying technocratic, that it would end up being like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, these guys coming in and using their economic and technological influence in the region?
That will be hammered out between the negotiating teams as this ceasefire process moves forward.
The sticking points.
Now, of course, we couldn't conclude this episode without at least some discussion of the many sticking points that still remain. Remember, this is a Phase 1 ceasefire deal, not a comprehensive peace accord, and either Hamas or Israel or both could reverse course at any time and for a wide range of different reasons. In fact, it's entirely possible that the ceasefire could fall apart before you even see this episode.
Yeah, remember, a ceasefire or an armistice is not a peace treaty. It's the first step.
It's entirely possible that the ceasefire could fall apart before you even see this episode, and while we don't expect that to happen, the lack of a diplomatic breakdown so far does not imply that a diplomatic breakdown isn't a real possibility. We'll start on the side of Hamas, where, first, there are the implications of Hamas's choice to return its remaining hostages, and, if it does as promised, to return the bodies of the deceased as soon as possible. For Hamas, releasing the hostages means taking a massive risk, and one that both Hamas and Israel fully understand. The prospect that Israel could secure the release of the hostages eventually, or that the hostages could be killed by Hamas or Israeli fire, has given Hamas most of the leverage that it wields against Jerusalem. With the hostages returned, Hamas hopes that Israel will no longer have sufficient pretext to continue the war, and the organization has implored Washington to ensure that Israel is kept in line and made to stick to its commitments. But if the Netanyahu government chooses to continue the war anyway, and to pursue the total destruction of Hamas that Netanyahu has treated as a critical wartime objective, then Hamas will have a much more difficult time forcing Israel back to the negotiating table.
Right. I mean, that's something they've said, from the beginning, from like Netanyahu was, Hamas just, I guess, puts down their guns and just dissolves immediately and completely, then it's all over. But one, would they be willing to do that? And second, would Palestinians believe the Israeli government?
And even if Netanyahu doesn't currently intend to return to war once the hostages are home, there are several outstanding issues that won't be addressed in this phase of negotiations. Hamas hasn't yet agreed to disarm, which Israel considers to be mandatory for a lasting peace, and Hamas certainly hasn't endorsed the part of Trump's plan in which Hamas has no role in a post-war Gaza. Already on Thursday, a senior Hamas official told Qatari media that the group will reject the idea of an international board of peace to oversee reconstruction. Then there's the question of the bodies of the deceased hostages, where it's entirely possible that Hamas genuinely cannot find and return some of them. Yeah. How long?
I mean, they've said that many may have died actually in Israeli airstrikes in certain places. I think earlier some of those hostages, because there's been other hostages exchanged. Some of the Israeli hostages, had said that attacks were happening right on their positions.
It's entirely possible that Hamas genuinely cannot find and return some of them. How long will Israel be willing to wait for a resolution before deciding that Hamas must be stalling and thus choosing to reopen the conflict? Or what if Israel doesn't agree to release the prisoners that Hamas is asking for? How massive of a sticking point could that become? What if Hamas finds that it can't control some of the most radical fighters within its ranks, or that it can't control its armed affiliates?
That's where I think this is going to be so difficult, because there's going to be those that don't want any type of compromise in the slightest. Like, even on both sides, people, again, that are going to be on the grounds with weapons and stuff. If it's some member of the, Hamas militancy, that's like, Israel needs to be gone entirely, or vice versa. And Israel says that Gaza needs to be wiped off the map and completely annexed. Like, those opinions have got to be there. And when you've been on the front lines of all this stuff and you've experienced, this for years, it's not surprising to see people become even more radicalized with those type of opinions and just want the total destruction of the other. But can those thoughts even be rooted in being a realistic possibility. Like, no.
The Palestinian Islamic Jihad. As for Israel, the political fate of Prime Minister Netanyahu is likely to be an outsized factor in whatever comes next. Israel is expected to hold elections no later than October 2026, although those elections could happen sooner if Netanyahu's government were to collapse, and the combination of war weariness, disillusionment with Netanyahu's leadership, and other domestic factors may be enough to see Netanyahu lose his position. Israel's premier is...
That could be an interesting thing. I mean, we know just in the history of war how decisions have often been made by decision makers when they are up for re-election. You know, they have to have results. If they don't, and whatever those results are, they're going to be gone. They're not going to have a job. They're going to be ostracized. So for someone like Netanyahu, what does that look like then? Could compromises, show some kind of like weakness, and that the most militant of his supporters don't agree with it? But then again, if hostilities continue, then those that want to seek peace alternatives, they lose their support. Politics tied with war decisions will always happen, especially in democratic societies.
The consummate political survivor, and by the estimation of many experts inside and outside of Israel, his desire to maintain a hold on power and avoid the specter of a corruption trial has been a large part of why the war in Gaza has lasted so long.
Let's say the ceasefire fails, right? And if Netanyahu has a few months or whatever until re-election, do you see some kind of like Sherman's March version of the war in Gaza? With what I'm referring to is like, as Abraham Lincoln, the U.S. Civil War was approaching re-election, it was becoming more and more important as it was getting closer to the actual election time that the war be over. So you saw really keys turned over to just go full annihilation mode with General Sherman through the South, and just, try to accelerate the end of the war through an incredible amount of destruction. Because it was like the war's got to be over, or like so close to being over that it gives confidence to voters. Doesn't seem impossible.
His coalition also exists at the pleasure of far-right leaders who could abandon him if Israel were to commit to a peace that they oppose.
Sure.
On the other hand, that could incentivize...
And that would be interesting in this situation if Netanyahu doesn't win, because he doesn't have support from either side of those that want to see this end in certain ways. What would the next leader be? Would the election process include candidates on very far spectrums when it comes to how they see this war wanting to end? I think that would be an interesting thing.
Netanyahu to return to war with Hamas once Israel's hostages come home in order to extend his mandate even further and try to garner popular support. Or it could incentivize Netanyahu to consider a possibility we discussed at length in the previous episode that we actually published yesterday, written before the news that a ceasefire could be imminent.
I mean, if you're on Hamas's side, that the idea of holding on to these hostages were to have like a bargaining chip of some kind, or to keep the Israeli military for being as destructive as they possibly could. Has that really been the effect of what's happened? No. There hasn't been any type of gain in this war going back to the October 7th attacks. Like, they haven't gained anything in the positive out of any of these things, from the attacks themselves to just the conduct and of how the war has gone and lack of success in it. If the long-term goal is Palestinian liberation, nothing has really pushed it in that direction. Now, could that happen in the long term? Don't know, but I've heard plenty of people say that you couldn't give into those desires for more, I guess, Palestinian, specifically Gaza autonomy, because that would then retroactively validate the ethics of the October 7th attacks. That it would be enabling that sort of thing. That is, I guess, an acceptable way to be able to achieve your political goals. And that would probably be a hard pill for the Israeli government and many of the Israeli people to swallow, and would likely have to then come from third-party countries to basically say, well, sorry, you don't get to be the ones to decide that. We're making the decision for you. That yes, there's going to be changes in the autonomy of Gaza and the West Bank, whatever that looks like. But is any country willing and able to actually do that? United States has, been the country in really in the driver's seat of being able to potentially hold back Israel or something like that. To what degree? I mean, that's debatable. Would a country like the U.S. be willing to put real tangible pressure on Israel to change basically their coexisting relationship between them and Palestine? I don't know.
After their 12-day conflict earlier this year, Israel and Iran both seem to be preparing for a return to conflict, and in prior periods of ceasefire in Gaza,
influence going to be over the end of this.
Turned Israel's attention toward Iran and other proxy militant groups that Iran supports.
I don't know if anyone's going to listen to
Twisted
Iran.
as it may be, an enduring peace in Gaza may make a wider war with Iran more likely, not less, if indeed Netanyahu sees a war effort as his best shot at remaining premier. According to insider reports, Netanyahu was under heavy pressure to accept this deal.
Sorry if it's loud. My dog's got zoomies right now.
If he had been allowed to act upon his own political calculus in this moment, a ceasefire probably wouldn't be.
That's when we're talking. If you're talking about long-standing peace, if that's possible, you know, something like it says here, Trump's maximum pressure on Israel. Would that basically be required? Probably. But can it be done tangibly? Because there's very little that, you know, Palestine can do to force Israel's hand. But the vice versa is far more possible, even if it requires incredible amounts of violence and destruction, which brings in that as a separate issue.
Allowed to act upon his own political calculus in this moment, a ceasefire probably wouldn't be happening. Beyond Netanyahu himself, it's not clear that the Israeli public would accept many of the terms in the peace accord proposed.
Well, ignorant on this. What are they holding here? What is this?
By Trump, particularly the stipulation for Hamas fighters to be granted amnesty and for Israel to avoid occupying or annexing the Gaza Strip.
The whole amnesty issue. Going back to the American Civil War, Confederate leaders and fighters were given amnesty after the Civil War. Would the Israeli government be willing to do that? That would be difficult, and you would probably, like we were saying before, could lose support base if it was done without forced pressure from the outside, like the United States.
Annexation is a very politically sensitive issue with plenty of staunch opponents inside Israel, but Israel is in a political moment where small, pro-annexation political parties maintain a controlling influence over domestic policy. Israel's far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, is a critical ally of Netanyahu and expressed in the wake of the ceasefire that he and his religious Zionism party would fiercely oppose an end to the war. On social media, Smotrich explains that he hopes that, quote...
Right. I mean, again, just showing that there are people, both sides, that are willing to see this to the end, whatever that looks like. That's scary.
Immediately after the hostages return home, the state of Israel will continue to strive with all its might for the true eradication of Hamas and the genuine disarmament of Gaza so that it no longer poses a threat to Israel.
This is where I was saying that Israel's in a situation they could do that whether they want to or not, with or without a hostage exchange. And I know with, you know, for many Palestinians, they believe that will be the case, that it will just, you know, they'll do their exchange and then the war will continue. But then again, not doing well in the war, and the current thought that there is any kind of leverage in this with having hostages isn't changing the outcome of what's happening to their situation there. So is it a gamble you're willing to take? Because I mean, the alternate scenario, they already know what that is. It's more of what we're seeing now, if not to a higher level, especially if other countries are going to intervene, which doesn't seem to be the case. There's plenty of condemnation going around the world, but little action.
Another far-right leader, Minister for National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, expressed agreement while offering a direct threat to Netanyahu, quoting him, "We are happy about the release of all hostages, but we will vote against the release of murderers. The Prime Minister committed to me that Hamas will be dismantled. If it doesn't happen, we will dismantle the government." And even for relative moderates in Israel, the idea that Hamas fighters would be...
But again, election coming up, but it's not to what they say is late 2026. There's a lot that can happen in a year. Again, a Sherman's March, if you will, could easily happen.
Granted amnesty and given safe passage to any place across the globe that they'd like to go to would be a difficult prospect to stomach. As always, the global Jewish population faces the threat of random anti-Semitic attacks all over the world.
People are
while
stuck
it wouldn't
there.
necessarily be a shock to see ex-Hamas militants fall in with other forms of radical ideology abroad, or even take up arms alongside other Iran-backed proxy groups. Luckily, those are all tomorrow's problems, and today we finally get to enjoy a bit of good news coming out of the Middle East. And yes, absolutely knock on wood right now. What happens next in Gaza, in Israel, and across the entire region, we'll have to wait and find out. But at least for today, the fighting in Gaza is over. We can only hope that somehow it stays that way.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching.
All right, so I try to present the nuanced, I guess, arguments that are going on that I think do have their roots in historical context of apprehension on both sides, things that are likely to need to happen, especially when it comes to third-party countries, what Israel and Hamas, and by extension the rest of the Palestinians, will have to agree upon, whether they, I guess, like it or not, to try to differentiate the actual plausible outcomes of what could happen this, rather than just the emotional reactions that drive so much of this. But again, historical context of this region still shows us that major changes will have to happen if there's going to be long-term progress. We've seen these type of things happen before, and the status quo doesn't change and hasn't changed very much. And changing the status quo is what is so difficult to do in the midst of the incredible amount of violence and destruction that can happen in times of warfare. To try to develop cool heads has often been very, very difficult because war is obviously emotionally charging. So I think in this case, there is justification to be both hopeful, but also be very skeptical and, dare I say, cynical about it. So all we can do is kind of, I guess, sit and wait. All right, guys, thanks for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time. Bye.